What's going on, guys? Moralltach Monthly 36 has just wrapped up, and it was a 66-person online H.A.T format tournament that was held through the H.A.T Alliance Discord server and played on Dueling Book. And today I wanted to go over what decks actually entered that event, talk about the event, and look at the top 8 deck lists, and see if there were anything cool that topped or any unique tech cards or anything like that, which, spoiler, there definitely was. This event had a lot of different decks enter, and so I'm really excited to actually go through this with you guys. So without further ado, let's actually get started. So here is the breakdown of what decks actually entered. As I mentioned, it was 66 players. I believe it was 7 rounds of Swiss and then top cut single elimination. So here we had 10 artifact trap tricks variants, 8 other. So these are going to be decks that aren't usually as represented as much. I believe there was like a couple Monarch decks, there was like a pure Koaki Miru deck, and a couple other decks that were kind of mixed into this category. After that, there were 7 Mermail, 6 Spellbook, 6 Mythic Ruler. I know a lot of people were hoping Mythic Ruler would make a bit of a comeback, and there definitely was, 6 being one of the larger chunks in this graph. 5 Geargia, 3 Bujin, 3 Sylvan, 2 Artifact Thunder. This is a deck that's been popping up a lot more recently. 2 Lightsworn Ruler, 2 Koaki Miru Fire Fist. This isn't the pure Koaki Miru list that I'm talking about. This is specifically the Fire Fist variant of that deck. 2 Hieratic Ruler, 1 Ghost Strick, 1 Geargia Karakuri, 1 Evil Swarm, 1 Madolche, 1 Gishki Hieratic. I know a lot of people like that deck when I've shown it off in the replays. 1 Dark World, 1 Constellar Artifact, 1 Artifact Agent, 1 Raccoon Turbo, and 1 Fire Fist Trap Tricks. So overall, a very nice widespread of decks in this. Again, 66 players, you'd expect it to be pretty diverse, but obviously some of these decks don't get represented quite as much as others, and you can just tell, usually Artifact Trap Tricks is taking up one of the top spots, but it's kind of nice to see now that, Geargia has kind of like died down a bit, whereas before Geargia was sometimes taking almost as many spots, if not as many spots as the Artifact Trap Tricks variants. So that's really cool to see. And then, as I mentioned, Mythic Ruler popping up a lot more, and, the Spellbook and Mermail popping up a lot more. It's really nice to see. You guys can let me know what decks you think were pretty unique here, but let's actually go and look at what decks took the top 8 spots in this tournament. So moving over, in first place was Geargia, and this wasn't Geargia hands. This was, I'm pretty sure, a more pure Geargia build. Second place was Fire Fist Trap Tricks. So the 1 Fire Fist Trap Tricks deck actually did make it to the finals, which is really cool to see. I've shown off this person's deck and their gameplay, I should say, on the channel already in some replay reviews, and I'm pretty sure I have a few more of their replays, so, look out for that in the future. In third and fourth was Bujin and then Geargia. I believe this Geargia variant was the hands variant. I could be wrong, so don't quote me on that, but that was, third and fourth. They always put third and third, but it's whatever. And then after that, for 4th through 8th, there was one of the others, which this is Hydro Pump. They were on the pure Koaki Miru deck, so that was able to top, and I'm really excited to take a look at their list. And then another one of the top 8 lists was another other deck, and this one was Chainbeat. So really cool to see that Chainbeat actually could make it to a top 8 finish. And so there's a lot of different versions of that deck, so I'm excited to look at that as well. Moving on, there was another Geargia. So this one, I'm not sure. It might have also been a hands variant. I'm not entirely sure on that one. And then lastly was a Geargia Karakuri. So despite there only being like 5 Geargia decks, and then I guess the 1 Geargia Karakuri, I believe, was marked as a separate deck, if I recall. Let me just quickly take a look back. Yeah, Geargia Karakuri. So there were technically 6 Geargia type decks, and we had 1, 2, 3, 4 out of the 6 actually make it to the top 8, which is really wild. And looking at this top 8, you'll notice no Mythic Ruler ended up making it, even though there were so many. no Mermail made it into top 8, and no Spellbook. So that's really kind of wild to think about. Maybe it means the format is slowing back down, how I've mentioned that a lot of times like Artifact Trap Tricks and the Geargia variants and stuff will usually take over the format before people start going with some of the more combo heavy decks. But from that breakdown, you do see a lot of those combo type decks, and you do see a lot of the decks that usually would represent that the format is, speeding up a little, but you aren't seeing them in the top 8 here, which is really interesting. Even like there was no H.A.T or Cat that made it into the top 8 from what it looks like. So that alone is also extremely interesting. So you guys will have to let me know what you think of that in the comments section down below. But anyways, let's move on to actually looking at these deck lists. All right, so here is that first place Geargia list. Again, it's not Geargia hands. And one thing I want to quickly note is because we're going to be covering so many different Geargia variants in this video, because again, so many ended up topping, I'm not going to keep going over all of the standard engine, but instead, as I go on after going over this one completely, we'll just look at the differences in the Geargia lists and stuff. So anyways, starting out though, for this main Geargia lineup that usually always stays the same, it's going to be 3 Accelerator, 1 Geargiano, 3 MK2, 3 Armor, and 3 Arsenal, as well as obviously the 3 copies of Geargia gear. Now, the interesting thing about this is right away I noticed they're only playing 1 DD Crow in the main and 2 Max C. A lot of times the Geargia decks will choose like 3 Max C or 3 DD Crow, and then sometimes you'll also see like 2 and 2. It looks like they kind of went with the same idea of keeping, just 3 hand traps in the main, but they decided to kind of split it up into 2 Max C and 1 Crow, which is a very interesting ratio, honestly. I think it's kind of funny to an extent. Obviously, Max C is really good, seeing that there was so much Mermail and Mythic Ruler and other type of those special summon heavy type decks. But it kind of weird to see just the 1 DD Crow, which I think is kind of funny. For the spells, we see 1 Book of Moon, 1 Mind Control, 2 copies of MST, 3 Soul Charge, and 3 Upstart. I feel like 3 Soul Charge isn't as standard anymore. I feel like a lot of times you'll see like the pure Geargia builds playing more so like 2 copies. And usually like Geargia Karakuri will play 3 because it's a little more reliant on being able to combo at times. So that is a little bit different. Same with, I guess, some people choose not to play like the Book of Moon or the Mind Control. A lot of times the 3 Upstart is somewhat standard. Some people don't like this. I think for consistency, it's completely fine. And obviously they got first place, so it completely worked out for them. And then 2 MST is also pretty normal. For the traps, they played 1 Bottomless, 2 Breakthrough, and 3 Fiendish. That's like a very standard ratio. I've talked about this so many times. Sometimes people will choose to play like 3 Breakthrough and 2 Fiendish. Other times it'll be like 3 and 3, but seeing both of these is completely normal. 1 Compulse, 1 Torrential, and 1 Warning. The interesting thing here is they're also choosing to play 2 copies of Trap Stun, so maybe they were thinking that there was going to be a lot of those control type decks. I feel like this list almost sort of reminds me of a Geargia Karakuri list, but they chose not to play obviously the Karakuri aspect of it. So that's kind of cool because like obviously like I mentioned, Geargia Karakuri usually plays 3 Soul Charge and 3 Upstart as well as playing Trap Stuns because they chose Trap Stun over something like Wiretap that Geargia would usually play. So very interesting to see that. But besides that, it's a pretty cool list. Let's look at the side deck here. They're playing the 1 Cycle Reader. This is very common because it's searchable with Geargigan X. They are choosing to play another Crow in the side, so I guess they were mindful of that. And then they are choosing to play the 3rd Max C, which is also always great to see when you have the rest of the playset here. Choosing to side the Dark Hole, that's also a bit interesting, but some decks do prefer to side that. Depending on what the matchup is, and just in general, it's a better going second card in a lot of cases. We see the 1 copy of Dimensional Fissure and the 3rd MST, very standard stuff. 2 copies of Blackhorn, 2 copies of DNA Surgery, 2 Debunk, 1 Macro, and 2 copies of Needle Sealing. All of that is extremely standard, and you'll see this a lot in a lot of these side decks, I would presume. Yeah, I mean, 2, 2, 2, 1, and 2 is pretty Normal, I always like 2-ofs in decks, so very nice to see that. And then looking at the extra deck, we see 1 Dweller, 1 Karen Gorgon, 1 Digusto Emerald, 1 Exciton, 3 Geargigan X, 1 Alucard, 1 Levier. I feel like... I don't know why. I feel like I don't really see Levier that much in Geargia, or maybe I'm just like having a brain fog right now, but I feel that's a little different. 1 copy of 101, 1 Ragnazero, 1 copy of Acid Golem, 1 Black Ship, 1 Soul of Silver Mountain, and 1 Zenmaines. Not choosing to play Crazy Box. I know sometimes the Geargia decks will play Crazy Box, but choosing not to play that, this is the only thing that's really throwing me off. Again, maybe I'm just forgetting from, looking at so many lists all the time, but that feels a little different there. But overall, pretty solid. I feel Geargia is one of those decks that just has a very basic extra deck. You don't see too much variance, so seeing a little bit of something is kind of nice. But anyways, let's move on to the second place deck list. Next up, we have the Firefist Trap Tricks deck. This deck isn't as common, so I don't want to say necessarily what's standard, but I guess I can kind of compare it to FAT, so the Firefist Artifact Trap Tricks deck. Just obviously this isn't playing the artifacts, so I would assume it's probably, looking at this, they might be playing some more trap cards, or even some of the hand traps are a little different, but looking at their list, they played 3 copy of Bear and 1 copy of Gorilla. That's, it makes sense to try to maximize on these a lot of times, because these are easy ways to kind of get to your Fire Formation cards and stuff, which can get you into Wolfbark, that can help you kind of get into rank 4s, as well as just Bear is a really good card against, say, the Geargia matchup, since it can pop monsters. The Gorilla can pop back row, and it's always also nice to have a little bit of variation, because if you're playing 3 copies of Bear, if you see them, sometimes you might want something that does something a little different. So Gorilla being able to pop back row and also set your Fire Formation spells when it destroys something by battle is kind of nice. Obviously, the 1 Wolfbark, as I mentioned, they're choosing to play 3 copies of Max C and 2 copies of Skullmeister. Skullmeister is very interesting in this deck, but I guess maybe if they're thinking they have a hard matchup against some of the hands, or just being able to stop other graveyard type effects, or effects that activate in graveyards, so maybe in the Mermail matchup, this would be very good. And obviously this is a deck that wants to get pluses as much as it can. A lot of times you see this kind of as a +1 engine. For example, like the Bear inflicts damage, it sets a Tenki, Tenki adds another thing, or Mermelio summons, adds a trap hole card. So, these kind of just ensure that you can get maximum advantage and kind of control the board state. Max C being able to give you draws, obviously, and Skullmeister's being, again, able to stop those grave effects. And then we see the 3 Mermelio and 2 Dioneo, which is a very standard Trap Tricks lineup. After that, for the spells, we see the 1 Dark Hole, 3 copies of Tenki, and 1 Tensu. I always like that. Again, similar to playing a Gorilla, just having some variance and not always having to search specifically a Tenki is nice. Then we see 2 copies of Lance. Being able to run over opponents' monsters is very important. Again, because Bear will, when it inflicts damage, be able to set these, or Gorilla can then set these when it destroys something by battle, which is nice. Also giving your stuff protection from things like Breakthrough Skill and other traps that can kind of disrupt you. 2 copies of Duality is a little interesting. I feel this deck plays slow enough that, you could kind of maximize on that, but you do have the 3 Tenkis as well, so I can completely understand that, but kind of cool to see that. 2 copies of Soul Charge and 3 Upstart, so lots of consistency in this deck, lots of 3-ofs as you can see, and if not, a lot of 2-ofs. After that, for the traps, they play the 1 Bottomless and the 1 Trap Tricks Trap Hole Nightmare. For the Mermelio searches, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, 1 Compulse, 2 copies of Debunk. I've talked about it. I think I even made a whole video talking about how people are starting to main this card from time to time. So just a really great card. It can stop hand traps. It can stop any sort of monster effect, like, for example, a High Priestess that's activating in hand, as well as stopping a lot of those graveyard type effects for, again, maybe say the Mermails or just the hands and different stuff. So very cool to see that. 1 copy of Solemn Warning, 1 Torrential, and 2 copies of Wiretap. Again, just a good way to kind of get a plus out of the opponent. Well, I guess it kind of breaks even, but, it gives the idea that your opponent is kind of safe for stuff. And playing, lots of 2-ofs, it kind of evens out nice, where you're not seeing just one, like you have a better chance of seeing like one wiretap and one lance. So that's kind of nice as well there. Looking at the side deck, more 2-ofs, they chose to play 2 DD Crow and 2 Flying Sea, so not really prioritizing one over the other, which I guess can kind of make sense. Max C is going to get you into a lot of your draws, so at that point, it doesn't really matter which one you're seeing necessarily. You don't always want to see multiples of these, of any of these really, because like once you have a Flying Sea in place, usually it puts you far enough ahead. DD Crow, maybe you'd want to see multiple of, or even Skullmeister maybe, but I think 2 and 2, as I've mentioned previously in this video, I really do like that sort of ratio. After that, we see the 1 copy of Dimensional Fissure, 1 Mind Control, and 3 MST. Obviously, you see they weren't playing MSTs in the main. This deck doesn't really, it wants to kind of grind through back row. You already have wiretaps to protect against some back row. You have lances to protect against some back row. Even Gorilla, again, can pop back row. Mermail can pop back row. So I feel like maybe in some of the grindier matchups you would put these in, but the deck kind of already plays fairly nicely into those. After that, it looks like they are playing the 1 Acid Trap Hole and 1 Deep Dark. Obviously, Deep Dark is really useful for a lot of those Dragon matchups and decks that play high levels in general, and Acid Trap Hole being just really good into the Geargia matchup or any deck that's a little slower. They are choosing to play the 3rd copy of Breakthrough Skill in the side too, which is nice to see, and 2 copies of Dimensional Prison. Obviously, another card that's just really good against the hands. When they go to attack in, you just banish it so they won't be able to float and stuff, which is very nice. And then 1 copy of Soul Drain here. Just this deck doesn't really have any graveyard type effects that need to worry about that specifically, so very good to see that. And in general, a lot of times the Fire Fist decks and the slower decks will play that. So, makes sense. Looking at the extra deck, we see the 1 Dweller, the 1, I forget what this card's called, Cardinal, or it's not Rooster. I forget the name of this one right now. Actually, I can probably just click it here, right? Nah, it's not going to load. Okay, so yeah, but this one, it shuffles back your Fire Fist or Fire Formation cards from your field or graveyard and then does the same to the opponent. So really good way to kind of put back resources and stuff. 1 Tiger King, 1 copy of Bujin's Kagetsuchi, 1 Emerald, 1 Direwolf, 1 Exciton, 1 Cowboy, 1 101, 1 Ragnazero, 1 Giant Hand, 1 Black Ship, 1 Rhapsody and Berserk, 1 copy of Heartland Draco, works really well with the Fire Formations, and the 1 copy of Crazy Box. Really cool list. I did watch some of their gameplay and stuff, and it's a really cool deck, and I hope this deck kind of takes off in popularity a little more, because it is really nice to see kind of this version of the deck without the artifacts and stuff like that. So really impressive here, but let's move on to the next list. Next up, we have Bujin. And so usually this is a pretty straightforward deck. There's not a whole lot of variance in standard Bujin, but there is a couple things to note. So right away, they're choosing to play 1 Harume and 1 copy of Mikazuchi. Sometimes people will like to play a second Harume, or they'll choose a second Mikazuchi. Here they're choosing just to play 1 and 1, which again isn't unheard of. It's just something to point out here. Obviously, the 3 copies of Yamato. What is interesting, though, is they're choosing to play only 2 copies of Crane, and it looks like in the place of the 3rd Crane, they're playing 1 copy of Bujingi. I'm trying to remember the name of this one. It's been a while. Sinew, I think. Bujingi Sinew. It's basically just a sort of like an Honest, but it banishes from graveyard instead. So I guess it kind of just gives you a little extra options in a sense. So really cool to see that. And then obviously they are on the 1 copy of Honest too. After that, they're playing 2 Hare, again, very standard, same with the 2 copies of Turtle and the 1 copy of Quillen. Now here they are also choosing to play 3 copies of Crow. This is very similar to how I mentioned with Geargia that usually they'll choose to play one or the other. Obviously, I see right here they are having the Max C's in the side. So prioritizing the DD Crows, which I'm sure helped a lot given, again, we saw a lot of Mermail, a lot of artifacts, and a lot of, what was it? Mermail, Mythic Ruler. So yeah. So just Crow is a great card in the format. I've said it before and I'll keep saying it. I think DD Crow in a lot of cases is better than Max C in hat format specifically. Obviously Max C is great card and it's extremely close, but I think just DD Crow as a whole hits more things. Whereas like say in a Bujin mirror match, Max C is not really going to give you much advantage or anything. But anyways, moving on to the spells, they chose to play 3 Carnation. I know a lot of builds will choose 2, so seeing 3 is a little bit different, but it's also not unheard of. The 1 copy of Dark Hole, 3 copies of Tenki, 2 Chalice, 2 Lance, very standard, 3 copies of Duality, and 3 Upstart for consistency, again, very normal. And then they had 3 copies of Breakthrough Skill. This is a really common occurrence in more modern Bujin that they are playing this, so seeing that, is cool. We see the 1 Bottomless, 1 Warning, and 1 Torrential. Choosing not to play a Compulse, I feel this deck doesn't really care about it, because usually if, a monster is going to attack into them, they can use something like the Honest or the Cranes, or just protect their monsters with things like the Turtle or the Hares, so this deck isn't really afraid of certain cards, so makes sense. Looking at the side deck, obviously, as I mentioned, the 3 copies of Max C, 1 copy of Mind Control, 3 MST, and 2 Twister. MST is very standard in the side deck for Bujin, but seeing Twister means they were probably kind of afraid of some of those more floodgatey type cards. Things like Macro can really hurt this deck, or Dimensional Fissure and stuff, so just extra back row removal is kind of cool. 3 copies of DNA Surgery. Obviously, this is really good into the Spellbook matchup, but also turning all of your smaller random Bujins into Beast Warriors means that all of your, specifically needing Beast Warrior type Bujin cards become just so much better. And then 3 copies of Debunk, as I mentioned before, just a really great card. Looking at the extra deck, they played 1 Dweller, 1 Kagutsuchi, 3 copies of Susanoo, and 1 copy of Tsukiyomi, 1 Constellar Omega, 1 Direwolf, 1 Exciton, Cowboy, 101, Rhapsody, or not Rhapsody, Ragna Zero, my apologies, 1 Black Ship, 1 copy of Heartland Draco, and the 1 Crazy Box. As I mentioned, a pretty straightforward list. The Sinew is really cool to see, and yeah, I hope we see more of that. That's a card I just always really liked, and very clean list as a whole, so let's move on to the next list. Alright, so here we have another Geargia list. As I mentioned before, this is a Geargia hands list, so I'm not going to go over the basic Geargia cards, but instead we're going to look at what's a little different. So obviously the first thing is they're playing the hands. They're playing 2 Fire Hand and 2 Ice Hand. This is the basic norm for the Geargia hands deck. You don't as often see 3 and 3, but it's also not completely unheard of. So this is completely normal. And then here's what I mentioned before about 2 copies of Crow and 2 copies of Max C. I feel the 2 and 2 ratio is a lot more normal versus the pure builds of Geargia where they're not playing the hands. So seeing, 2 and 2 is also really nice. They just have great matchups in certain cases. After that, we do see the 1 Dark Hole, the 1 Mind Control, 2 MST, and 2 Soul Charge. So this is kind of how I mentioned before, how that first place was playing 3 Soul Charge and the Upstarts, which was a little bit different for kind of a pure Geargia list, or even say this Geargia hands list. This is a lot more standard. After that, we do see they're choosing to play 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill and 2 Fiendish, so not playing like 3 and 2 the way a lot of Geargia lists will. Instead, it looks like they have the 1 copy of Bottomless, 1 Torrential, 1 Warning, and it looks like probably, I would guess, in place of one of the either Breakthroughs or Fiendishes, they're choosing to play a copy of Needle Sealing, which a lot of times you do see Geargia playing Needle Sealing, sometimes it's just as a one-of, or in the side deck, how we saw previously, so they are choosing to play 1. And then lastly, this deck is choosing to play the 2 Wiretaps, which is a lot more standard versus how the first place was playing the Trap Stuns. So overall, I would say this build is a little more standard. Obviously, some of the ratios like the 2 and 2 here is slightly different, but overall, this is kind of what you'd expect out of this deck. Even looking at the side deck, again, we see the one cycle reader here. They are choosing to play the third copy of Crow and Max C. Love to see it. The one Dimensional Fissure, and there's the third MST. And similar to how I mentioned before, here's again 2 copies of Blackhorn, 3 copies of Debunk. This deck is again one of those grindy decks, so this can really give you the advantage in a lot of matchups. They are playing the third Breakthrough in the side, so, I guess in theory, if they probably weren't playing the Needle Sealing in the main, I would assume it would probably be something like 3 Breakthrough and the 2 Fiendish anyways. The 1 macro, another copy of Needle Sealing. This is again great against some of those decks that can really spam out monsters. The 3rd copy of Wiretap and the Soul Drain to round out the side deck. Looking at the extra deck, how I said that Geargia is usually pretty standard, I believe everything here is exactly the same as that first place. The only difference is the one card that I mentioned, and I knew I wasn't going crazy about that, and that is the copy of Leviair. Obviously, this build is not playing Leviair, and instead it looks like, I think the only difference is going to be this copy of Rhapsody and Berserk. Here I can go back to the first place. Yeah, they were not on Rhapsody. So this one obviously is playing that, and I would say that this is kind of just the generic extra deck that you would see. Again, sometimes people will choose to play something like a Crazy Box in this deck, but for the most part, this looks completely normal. So next up, I think, is the pure Koaki Miru deck, so very excited to take a look at that, so let's get straight into it. So here we do have the pure Koaki Miru deck, and again, this isn't a deck that really you see often. Usually it's going to be those Fire Fist variants of this deck, so I'm not going to necessarily say that this is standard or not, but I can point out what is and isn't for the other versions. So for example, 3 copies of Crusader and 3 Urnite isn't the most unheard of, and also the copy of Koaki Miru Ice. Now the thing with this deck is it is main decking 3 copies of Koaki Miru Drago, which is very, very good. It's extremely impressive being a floodgatey type monster that you can special off of the Urnite, and being able to stop your opponent from special summoning light and dark monsters, or I should say both players, but a lot of this is other types of attributes anyways. Very, very good card, and I watched a couple matches from this player, and this card definitely puts in a lot of work, like especially when you see your opponent just like set a couple Sanctums or something, or say like an Ignition and a Artifact, thinking they're going to be able to just kind of pop off, and you start the turn by just normaling this. You basically put your opponent behind instantly, so really cool to see that. The other thing is 3 copies of Koaki Miru Maximus. This card is really, really strong just as a 3000 beater, and paired with stuff like the tour guides, you go tour guide into tour guide, and then you overlay both into a copy of Invoker, and then Invoker is able to special summon Urnite. Urnite can then reveal a Iron Core, and then special something like a Crusader, and it just gets out of control extremely quickly, and surprisingly for a deck that can play on the slower, grindier side of things, this deck can also just OTK out of nowhere, so really, really cool. Also, obviously, this is like all gas in terms of engine, so they aren't playing any hand traps in the main. That's something I noticed very quickly. So that is a little interesting. After that, we see 2 copies of Core Compression. This is sort of like trade-in for Koaki Mirus. I think you have to like discard a Koaki Miru monster and then reveal an Iron Core, and then you draw 2 or something like that. Really interesting card. After that, 3 copies of Core Transport Unit, 3 copies of Diamond Core, and 3 copies of Iron Core. So in order to special Maximus, you have to banish a Iron Core, and obviously most of this deck, well, all of it really revolves around the Iron Core. So just, I guess they're playing, 9 copies of Iron Core basically, because the 3 copies of Transport Unit, 3 copies of Diamond Core, and 3 Iron Core itself. So really trying to find that as quickly as possible. And then 3 copies of Tenki, obviously, to get to your Urnites and stuff. 2 copies of Tensu, that one actually surprises me a little, but Tensu is a way, since Urnite isn't once per turn, it's like a soft once per turn. Seeing that is kind of nice. I'm sure if you already open like an Urnite and a way into your Iron Core and stuff. Also, I guess I should mention the Diamond Core protection is really strong into a lot of back row and stuff, so that's kind of nice as well. Then the last spell is just 3 copies of Soul Charge. Obviously, this deck can play, how I mentioned, at a slower pace, and the fact that this deck can easily put up rank 4s and stuff, the Soul Charge kind of makes sense. Also, I had kind of just looked at the extra deck, and I do see a lot of different options, so I feel like sometimes the Soul Charge probably can just come up. I think seeing 3 is kind of interesting to me. I wouldn't have expected that had you told me before looking at this list. Koaki Miru, I would assume, usually would play like 1 or 2, so seeing that, you know, this build is a little heavier on, well, obviously on the Koaki Miru sides of thing, I could see that trying to get into your Xyz as quickly as possible, especially, you know, this deck can turbo out rank 4s and make like Dwellers and other stuff, is extremely strong. And then for the trap cards, it looks like it's a lot of back row hate. It's going to be 3 copies of Reckon Power, which basically, you know, it's really nice to start out the game. Set this, your opponent is, say, like a Artifact Trap Tricks player, they set all their back row, and say you ended on a Dweller plus this, you Dweller them, you Reckon Power, destroy all their set spell and traps, they aren't going to trigger because of the Dweller, and at that point you can just kind of OTK or put enough pressure and get ahead far enough that you're just winning the game. And 2 copies of Trap Stun, so just a way to really shut down those traps, along, again, paired with the Diamond Cores. It's a very good, solid overall deck, and it's really nice to see this. I haven't seen like the pure builds actually pop up in these tournaments, so very nice to see. Moving on to the side deck, we see 1 copy of Bear. How I mentioned previously, in decks that play Tenki, it's nice to always have an extra option. Here we do see the 3 copies of Max C in the side, but no copies of DD Crow, which is extremely interesting. But obviously, again, this type of deck just getting as much pluses, slowing down the combo decks, and then putting a lot of pressure is nice. The deck already kind of deals with the other decks as well as it needs to. After that, the 1 Dark Hole, 1 Dimensional Fissure, 1 Mind Control, and 3 MST. I would assume you'd put these in more so going second over maybe some of the traps. Then for the traps in the side, we see the 3rd copy of Trap Stun, really good card, as I said before. 1 Soul Drain, 1 Macro, and 2 copies of Black Horn of Heaven. Looking at the extra deck, they are playing 2 copies of Dweller. This deck can make it extremely easy. 1 Tiger King, 1 Kagutsuchi, 1 Karen Gorgon, 1 Direwolf, 1 copy of Felgran, which is really cool because of obviously Maximus being a level 8. It gives you an option. 1 copy of Exiton, 1 Cowboy, 1 copy of Lavaval Chain, 1 copy of Lightning Chidori, which is funny, but if you have, you know, double Koaki Miru Drago, you can go into it. The 1 copy of Invoker for the tour guide play, 1 101, 1 Black Ship, and 1 copy of Rhapsody and Berserk. Kind of interesting not to see a Daigusto Emerald. I feel like that might come up in certain situations, but I guess for the most part, you're probably not wanting to put back your resources in a sense because you kind of play out of your graveyard with things like the Soul Charges, and I guess you just have enough, you know, basic stuff you can do in this deck that the games are usually going to end pretty fast, whether you're winning or losing, so kind of cool, but overall really nice deck, so let's move on to the next one. Slight technical difficulty, so I had to swap to a different website to actually go over these deck lists. I do apologize for that, but the formatting is also very nice on this site. This is Arm's site, hatformatmeta.com. But anyways, getting into the next profile, we have the Chainbeat deck, and there is a lot to look at with this list. I'm going to go through everything, and then we can talk about it. So here we see 3 copies of Card D, 3 copies of Evil Swarm Thunderbird, 3 copies of Maxi, 3 copies of Wind Up Rabbit, and that is it for the monsters. After that, we see 3 copies of Black Garden, 1 copy of Book of Moon, 1 copy of Dark Hole, 1 copy of Dimensional Fissure, 1 Pot of Dichotomy, 3 copies of Duality, and 1 copy of Steel of Orichalcos. After that, for the traps, there are a lot. They are playing the 1 copy of Bottomless, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, 3 copies of Compulsory Escape Device, 2 copies of Dimensional Prison, 1 Macro, 2 Mirror Force, 1 Warning, 3 copies of Stygian Dirge, 1 copy of Torrential, and 1 copy of Wiretap. So right away, yeah, there's a lot to talk about. So this deck usually doesn't play that many monsters, so seeing that they aren't on the most monsters does make sense. Now, what I will say is this deck usually will play something like a Fire Fist engine a lot of times, or some of the more, I guess, stun-type monsters, things like Banisher of the Radiance, or something like Thunder King Ryo. But again, there are so many different ways you can actually play Chainbeat. Like, for example, some people like Widespread Dud and other stuff. So it looks like in terms of monsters, they just really wanted to focus on either getting to a Wind-Up Rabbit or getting to a card like Thunderbird. Obviously, Card Car is great to get into a lot of your card advantage, whether that's drawing traps or, again, similar with Max C, you're just trying to draw into your back row, stun out the opponent, and be able to get in little chip damage over time. Besides that, you know, Seal of Orichalcos was a card that I feel like a long time before Hat format, a lot of stun decks would play. Obviously, this says all monsters you control gain 500 attack, and then once per turn, this card cannot be destroyed by card effects. While you control 2 or more face-up attack position monsters, your opponent cannot target your monsters with the lowest attack for an attack, so it's a way to protect your monsters as well. And then if this card's activated, destroy all special summon monsters you control. Obviously, this deck isn't really going to be doing that, and then you can't special summon from the extra deck. Again, very irrelevant for this deck. It is just more of a stun deck. Other than that, playing 3 copies of Compulsory Escape Device makes sense because you're obviously playing the 3 copies of Black Garden. Some people will choose to only play 2 of this, but if they're prioritizing getting to Black Garden, then it makes sense. Obviously, you have ways to get into it with the card cars as well as the dualities and things like that. And then they're playing the 1 dichotomy because all their monsters are different types. The Wind-Up Rabbit is a Beast Warrior, the card cars are machines, the Thunderbirds are thunders, and the Maxis are insects. So this is basically live as long as you see monsters. The Stygian Dirge is really good because so many decks are, you know, trying to make Xyz and stuff. I feel this card isn't as good into the Mythic Ruler matchup or the Ruler matchups, or even sometimes Sylvan because they play so many different ranks and levels and stuff, but still a very good card against something, say, like Geargia or any of those rank 4 focus type decks. One of the funnier things I'm noticing with this list is looking at the side deck, it looks like they're smoke screening into H.A.T, basically, because they have 3 copies of Moralltach, 3 copies of Mermail, 2 copies of Ignition, 3 Sanctum, and obviously then you have, you know, Trap Holes, which they're choosing to play 2 copies of Deep Dark Trap Hole and 2 copies of Trap Trick Trap Hole Nightmare. And I kind of think this idea is funny because obviously, like, Mermail is a very good standalone card, being able to search your trap holes and stuff, but also siding into artifacts in a deck like this is really, really funny because when your opponent plays against this deck, usually they're going to put in a lot of back row removal. And so if they're not expecting the artifacts because they didn't see it, say, game 1 or something, or even, you know, game 2, it can be really funny when your opponent goes to try to say like MST or just like pop your back row, and then they get completely blown out because they hit something like a Sanctum or a Moralltach. So I think that's really clever and really, really funny to see in a deck like this. Again, this deck has so many different variants, so seeing something like that is really innovative in a sense. And I always love when decks can do funny tricks like that. And also just looking at their extra deck, it looks very similar to a Hat or Cat type extra deck, being 1 copy of Dweller, 1 copy of Durendal, 1 Karen Gorgon, 1 Pleiades, 1 Exiton, the 1 copy of Ophion, which is kind of a funny card. Usually Chainbeat does play that because if you have double Thunderbird, you can go into the Ophion, and that's just a way to kind of floodgate higher level decks out of the game. 1 copy of Cowboy, 1 Gaia Dragon, 1 Alucard, 1 101, 1 Volcasaurus, 1 Rhapsody and Berserk, 1 Heartland Draco, 1 Tyrus, and 1 Zenmanes. So really solid extra deck. Like I said, like the lower half of this, you would think that it is just a basic hat or cat type list, but obviously looking at the main deck, it is just the coolest thing. So really nice to see that. And so, yeah, let's move on to the next list. I believe it's going to be that Geargia Karakuri deck. Apologies in advance of how long this video is, there's just so much to cover, but again, this is one of the Geargia lists, and I believe the next deck is also a Geargia list. I believe that one's going to be Geargia Hands, so let's just go over what's a little different. Obviously, out of the Geargia variants, this is a very different one in a sense. The main engine is the same for Geargia, but what is different is obviously this player is maining 3 copies of DD Crow, and then they're obviously also playing the Karakuri side of things, playing the 2 copies of the Sylvan, the Watchdog, which again, well, I guess not again, but in general, 2 copies of the Watchdog is standard in Geargia Karakuri, and then the 1 copy of Strategist and 1 copy of Birdman as kind of your synchro engine. That's all very normal. Here, how I mentioned that Geargia Karakuri usually plays 3 Soul Charge and 3 Upstart Goblin, we are seeing that here, as well as 3 copies of Trap Stun, how I said before. Now, this list is also choosing to do the ratio of 3 Fiendish Chain and 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, which is very normal, and this is another deck that also can play macro in the main, simply because when you need to, you can turn it off with your Trap Stuns and stuff, and be able to combo off, but then being able to, play macro hurts so many different decks. And that's why in so many of these lists, you either see it in the side deck or in the decks that can main it, like this one, for example, or that Chainbeat deck, you definitely see that. Looking at the extra deck, they are playing the 1 copy of Black Rose, 2 copies of Beret, and 1 copy of Beredo. I've talked about this in the past in other videos, but some builds will be more level 8 and rank 8 focused, and they'll play, 2 copies of Beredo and 1 copy of Beret, but it's a little less common, so seeing that is very normal. And then 1 Scrap Dragon and 1 copy of Stardust. So not choosing to play Leo and not choosing to play Star Eater, which some builds like, some don't. And then after that, obviously the only other difference is going to be the 1 copy of Big Eye and 1 copy of Dracosac. But again, that's also extremely normal in Geargia Karakuri. In terms of the side deck, it all looks very standard too. The 1 Cycle Reader, 3 Max C, Dark Hole, Dimensional Fissure, 1 Mind Control, 3 MST, kind of going along with the same pattern of, you might want to side out Trap Stuns and put in MSTs depending, or at least cut down on some ratios. The 3rd Breakthrough Skill, 3 Debunk, and the 1 copy of Soul Drain. But that is it for this list. Very clean and, can't go wrong with a very straightforward list. So let's move on to the last list of this video. So last up, we do have another Geargia Hands list. Very similar to the other one, we have the 2 Fire and 2 Ice Hands. The one difference is this build is playing 2 copies of Max C in the main, but not playing the Crows in the main. Obviously, we see them sided here, along with the 1 Cycle Reader and the 3rd Max C. The other thing that I'm seeing is, the 2 copies of Soul Charge, very similar. 3 MST in the main. I believe the other build was on 2 copies, I believe. Here, let me see if I can find it real quick, which I can. So 2 copies of MST, so they are doing that. The other thing I'm noticing with this list is they are maining the Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare and a 2nd Wiretap, as well as the other build was on 2 Breakthrough and 2 Fiendish. This one is on the 2 Breakthrough and 3 Fiendish. But other than that, it all looks very similar. Looking at the extra deck, they are playing the Emerald, they're playing the Giant Hand, the 3 Gear Gigant. Everything else basically looks the same. I think the one difference was the Giant Hand. I think the other one was on Ragnazero, so I think that's the only difference there. And then again, the side deck is extremely standard. 2 copies of Blackhorn, your DNA surgeries, your debunks. The only 1 copy of Needle Sealing in the side here, versus, the other build was on like 1 and 1, and then I think there was one that was siding 2. But besides that, again, a very basic Geargia type list. But that is it for this video. Again, really cool event and 66 players, which is huge. That's always great to see. Hat format is growing. I think the one other thing to note is we didn't see any Infernity, which Infernity isn't like the craziest deck. Also, you know, 3 Sylvan is a pretty large chunk here. Sylvan isn't as common as it used to be, but I guess out of 66 players, it's kind of nice to see. But you guys can let me know what you think in the comment section of this video for this event. But hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like on this video, comment any questions or videos you want to see in the future, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out, share this video with your friends, and there is a couple more hat format tournaments coming up very soon. So expect to see another one of these recap videos on those. I don't know how big those events are going to be yet, but keep an eye out for that. But anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.